Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon, episode 90, the top 10 wives of the Marshals. Before we begin, I'd like to remind all of our listeners that if they'd like to support our podcast, please go to patreon.com/Generals and Napoleon. As always, we appreciate your support. Now, on with the show. We have a legendary guest on the phone, my dear friend all the way from Scotland, Rachael Stark. Hello, Rachael.
Hello. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Very good, thank you. Yeah.
Thanks for joining the show again. If my listeners forget, Rachel's done some stellar work with me previously. We've done a few Marshals episodes because both Rachael and I are big Marshals fans. But we're going to do something a little bit different today, Rachael. What are we going to discuss today?
Instead of looking at the Marshals today, we're actually going to look at the women behind the baton. So we're going to look at their wives.
So yeah, we're going to do a top 10 wives of the Marshals. And this is, there's no science to this, right, Rachael? This is just our opinion of who the top 10 are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a bit like ranking the Marshals. It's so subjective. And if you divorce it completely from battlefield statistics, whether you're looking at Marshals wife, you're inherently going to be drawn to the personalities or the characteristics you personally respect. So it's going to be completely different from person to person. You know, I very famously, I'm not very keen on Murat, but I can understand why people are drawn to him. I'm a big fan of Davout, and I understand why some people aren't.
And it's not necessarily like, were they good wives or not, or were they an asset to the emperor or not? It's just what they did in their careers as the Marshal's wife.
Yeah, why we find them interesting and why we're drawn to their stories.
Okay, well, before we jump into our top 10, what do you think were some of the pros and cons of being a wife of the Marshal of the Empire?
In terms of pros, obviously the social mobility was extraordinary. Some, like the Marshals themselves, they came from a broad diversity of socioeconomic backgrounds, and some of them very much came from what we would now call, proper working class origins. And to think you've gone from sort of manual labor and a life where you had probably very little in terms of economic prosperity to look forward to go to being a duchess or a princess, to amass huge fortunes, because Napoleon was very generous to the Marshals in terms of the finances. The sheer social mobility of it must have been, absolutely mind-blowing to reflect on how far they'd come. So yeah, absolutely.
I think, I mean, a case in point, Marshal Lefebvre's wife was a washerwoman, and I'm assuming they didn't have a lot of money, so it must have been like hitting the lottery when he became a marshal.
Yeah, I mean, from a washerwoman to a duchess is the famous expression. And I mean, they very famously never forgot where they'd came from, and they were very conscious of their roots, and they were always very aware of, their friends and their relatives who hadn't made that meteoric jump. Others became, other Marshals became very grand, and quite carried away with their own importance. But the financial compensation must have been brilliant if you'd come from humble origins.
Yeah, and the other part of it was just the popularity. I know Napoleon expected his marshals to host fetes and parties and balls and that kind of thing. So to go from maybe being obscure to being very popular almost overnight must have been thrilling to some, but maybe to other wives who are more austere, they didn't like it as much.
Yeah, I mean, Marshal Davout's wife, Marshal Massena's wife, they kind of stayed away from court, but Madame Lannes, Madame Ney, quite a few of them were very active in Napoleon's court and very popular members of it, and very much involved in the fashion of the era. So again, that must have been quite the thrill when you've not been born a nobody. That's simplification, but it must have been meteoric for them.
Yeah, indeed. So, I mean, access to the emperor and just have access to the latest fashions, jewels, money must have been great. But what were some of the cons to being a marshal's wife?
I mean, the most obvious was that their husbands were away a lot of the time in battle, and in an era where there were no instantaneous communication, of course. So the stress that must have involved, you waved goodbye to your husband and you didn't know if he was coming home, you didn't know if he was going to be grievously wounded, were you going to lose him on the battlefield, what was going to be involved there. Obviously Madame La and Madame Bessières, they did lose their husbands on the field of battle, the widowhood of that. And of course, an absent husband at a time when they might have been going through pregnancy or child loss must have been an added trauma. I mean, Louise Lang, she was pregnant pretty much almost constantly for like the first 5 years of her marriage, but Lang was gone, most of the time. So it's a heavy enough burden, or a big struggle in some cases, if you've had a difficult pregnancy or a miscarriage, in the modern era with modern medicine and modern support. It's been really, really difficult to have to do that virtually on your own because your husband was halfway across Europe, fighting with Napoleon.
Yeah, you make good points there. To not only are they away and you have to raise the kids and maintain the household, there's an excellent chance that your husband may die in Lan and Bessier's case, but they may come back very grievously wounded, like Oudinot and Marmont. I think the other con is after Napoleon's downfall, their treatment by the Bourbons was probably very horrible as well.
For some of them, certainly. I mean, it depended very much where their husbands' allegiances had lain during the 100 Days. So, of course, Davout rallied to Napoleon, and the Davouts suffered quite heavily for that. Grouchy had to go off into exile, and so his wife was separated from him. And whereas, Oudinot, his wife became a great friend of the Bourbon queen, and they enjoyed a very honourable position at court. Victor became an Bourbon zealot, so his wife continued to benefit from those associations. So it very much depended where their husbands had allied themselves during the 100 Days.
Yeah, I remember Marshal Ney's wife was mocked almost mercilessly by the Bourbons, and obviously Marshal Ney didn't put up with that.
No, I mean, he very famously stomped into the Tuileries and tore the Duchess of Angoulême verbally to shreds for having upset his wife. And the sad reality was that the Duchess of Angoulême could have probably been a little bit more civil to Ney's wife, because there was a very strong connection between them, in that Madame Ney's mother had been a maid to Marie Antoinette, and she'd actually taken her own life after the Queen's execution. So she could have stood to actually have been a little bit more civil to Madame Ney.
Agreed. Okay, well, we're going to dive in to our top 10, but before we get to number 10 as our launching off point, who did we rate as the 26th wife of the Marshals? What was the worst wife of the Marshals, in your opinion?
Well, the one I dislike the most is matches up with a Marshal that I dislike the most, actually, and that is Madame Murat, Caroline Bonaparte.
Yeah.
And she gets a fair paste in quite a lot of fronts, and some of that's misogynistic in nature, because for some of the things I've seen her be criticised for, they've praised it in her husband. So I just kind of want to make it very clear that I hold her and Murat to exactly the same standard.
Right.
I'm not a big fan of either of them.
Right. Yeah, some people say, she was too Machiavellian, but that's considered an asset amongst men. So that's a great point right there.
Yeah, I mean, Murat gets away with a hell of a lot because he's glamorous. They call Marmont and Grouchy and I mean, the whole Grouchy thing's a complete other kettle of fish.
Yeah.
But Murat turned long before Marmont did.
And the other thing about Caroline is it wasn't just Napoleon who despised what she did when she turned against him, but Napoleon's mother, right, Madame Marat.
She never spoke to her for the rest of her days. She wouldn't see her. She was so disgusted that Caroline had turned on her brother, she wouldn't see her afterwards, even when Caroline had been widowed after Marshal Murat had got himself executed.
Right.
And it's difficult not to feel sympathy for Caroline and the circumstances of her widowhood. But no, Madame Mère, she wouldn't forgive it.
Yeah, no, that's a great example right there of what an awful person Caroline was perceived to be, even by her relatives. And I remember also reading that when her mother died, she was fighting with her other brothers over the inheritance, which also shows that Caroline clearly didn't save any of her money as Queen of Naples. She was still scrounging over her mother's inheritance.
I mean, I think, in fairness, none of the Bonaparte siblings were particularly nice people. It's difficult
True.
to find much to say about them that's positive in personal, circumstances. They were all greedy, they were grasping, they were vain. Quite a few of them stabbed Napoleon in the back repeatedly. Some of them had some talent, but nothing to his. So again, I'm not singling Caroline out here. Certainly her brothers were just as bad, if not worse.
Right.
But I mean, Caroline was described by, I think it was Talleyrand, that said she'd Cromwell's head on a man's body.
That's right.
She was capable. She proved herself an able regent, actually probably more so than her husband, as Queen of Naples. But they were vindictive. She and her husband were awful to Josephine. I mean, all the Bonaparte women hated Josephine. They were effectively pimping mistresses out to Napoleon to try and get him to prove his fertility.
Right.
She was just, I get the sense that she was a deeply unpleasant person.
Well, we started with Caroline, number 26. There was only one marshal who did not have any wives, correct?
That was Marshal Poniatowski.
Okay.
He didn't have a wife. He did have numerous mistresses, but nobody ensnared him enough to settle down. And then, of course, famously, he was the 3-day marshal. He died after the Battle of Leipzig, and so never lived to marry after the end of the Napoleonic Wars.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and jump from that number all the way to number 10, but I want to point out, if you want to learn about all the Marshals' wives, please check out Rachel's blog. It's a WordPress. You can find it on her Twitter page at the top. Rachel's Twitter handle is bookish_Rachel, RACHAEL. And then you can go there and learn about all the wives through that blog, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Just want to point that out. If you want to learn, because I only do an hour podcast, so it's hard to get to all 25 of the Marshals' wives. So we're just picking the top 10. Who is, just so my audience know, who almost made the cut? Who's number 11?
Number 11 would have been Madame Bessières, who somebody I have a lot of sympathy for, but I think she was a woman of no small amount of courage as well.
Yeah, she was devoutly Catholic like her husband. Unfortunately, after her husband died, she found out a lot of disturbing things, correct?
Yeah, well, I mean, he left her in quite substantial debt, and Napoleon, who was genuinely very attached to Bessières, settled the debt and promised his wife that she would continue to benefit from the fondness he'd had for her. So, I mean, it kind of took care of the financial issues, but in sorting through his papers, she had been under the impression that they'd had a mutually devoted marriage, and their correspondence is certainly very loving and very tender to each other. But she found out after his death that he'd been keeping an opera dancer as a mistress, and to find that out in the fresh flushes of widowhood must have been particularly brutal.
And coupled with the debts that she didn't know about, that must have been, I mean, talk about three whammies: your husband, death, debts, and a mistress. That, I don't know how she recovered.
Yeah, it's a really sad story.
Yeah, well, credit to her for recovering from that. Moving on to number 10. This one I have a lot of questions for, but I'm going to go ahead and let you do the intro on it. Who's number 10?
So number 10 is a woman who, it would be an extreme understatement to describe her life as a roller coaster. because she at one time was engaged to Napoleon, so had reasonable expectation of becoming the future Madame Bonaparte. She then became Madame Bernadotte and ended her life as Queen of Sweden. It's Désirée Clary.
Yeah, you and I always talk about this, when we talk about Bernadotte, that he won the Napoleonic Game of Thrones, as did Desiree. But she wasn't very happy as Queen of Sweden, was she?
No, she wasn't. She actually, of all the Marshals, would have had the most comfortable life in terms of material possession and money. But she didn't have a particularly happy marriage. And who knows, had she become Madame Bonaparte, she potentially might have been happier. It's impossible to say.
Right.
But Desirée was very passionately and patriotically French. She was very much attached to Paris. And when Bernadotte was initially given the title of Prince of Pontecorvo, she was quite anxious that she thought that meant they'd have to live elsewhere, but was reassured that it was just a title, it was a dignity that sort of enhanced their position in the imperial court.
Right.
Of course, in 1810, Bernadotte, through his humane conduct with with Swedish prisoners of war earlier on in the conflict, found himself elected as heir to the throne of Sweden. And it was explained to her this wasn't just a title. This meant she had to leave Paris and she had to move to Sweden.
Right.
And she actually said, I thought that it'd just been the case as with Pontecorvo. I thought it was a place from which we'd have a title.
Right.
And he left without her initially, and she'd kept delaying her departure from France. And it was best part of a year before she'd join him. But she wasn't happy in Sweden. She had a fractious relationship with the Queen Charlotte. She was noted as being a French woman in every inch. She hated anything that wasn't French. They thought she was whiny. They thought she complained all the time. They said she was much disliked. She found it very difficult to adapt to the requirements of the Swedish court, and she said the Swedes treated her coldly. So she felt lonely. They thought she was whiny. She left again in 1810, so she didn't stay long initially, on the grounds of her health. I think it was probably extreme homesickness.
Yeah.
And she returned to Paris, and she lived sort of in disguise almost as a countess. And frequent visitors to her house were Talleyrand and Fouché. So you do wonder what was discussed in those circumstances.
I thought it was interesting too. She despised the weather up there, and when she got back to Paris, I saw that someone asked her about Stockholm, like the weather there, and she said, "Don't even use that word. I catch a cold whenever I hear that word."
Yeah, she really wasn't happy at all. And she stayed in Paris even after Bernadotte had become king, and that was obviously causing a lot of chit chat. And she, at some point in her stay in Paris, she fell in love with Richelieu, the French prime minister,
That's
who
right.
did not reciprocate.
Yep.
And she would deliberately go to where he was, and some of the accounts of her behavior are quite interesting, because we'd probably class that as stalking, almost in the in modern parlance.
Right.
But yeah, she stayed in Paris, and she didn't go back to Sweden until 1823, and just, she wanted to leave again quite soon, but Bernadotte put his foot down, didn't let her leave the country again, and she was finally crowned, more than 10 years after her husband had become king, in 1829. But the marriage had been distant. By that point, they weren't living together in the true sense. And she became this sort of very eccentric. Her reputation warmed somewhat. She became sort of viewed as being a benign eccentric in the reign of her son. Bernadotte predeceased her, and then her son became King Oscar.
Yeah.
She would sleep like half the day, then stay awake all night. She would try to call on people at, really unsociable hours, like 4 a.m. But by that point, her public perception had thawed. She was considered quite kind. She did a lot of charity work.
Right.
But her son predeceased her as well. So by the time she died in 1860, her grandson was King of Sweden. So she died a queen. I'm not sure she had a particularly happy life. In all honesty, I don't think the crown was compensation.
Yeah, that is a great what if though. If she had married Napoleon, gosh, there's so many what ifs there. Like, would Bernadette even have become a marshal?
Well, that's true. I mean, I think probably yes. Napoleon knew he had to be careful with Bernadotte. He was popular. He was a bit of a rival, and I think he needed to keep him close to his chest.
Yeah.
And like giving the baton was a method of doing that.
Yeah.
I mean, Napoleon treated Desiree like a self-help project. It wouldn't have been a healthy relationship either, in all honesty. The letters to her, he was all about what she should do and what she should read and how she should conduct herself. He didn't respect her. He might have loved her, I guess, had they married, but he certainly didn't respect her.
All right.
She obviously was fertile. She had a son.
Right.
What would that have meant for France, potentially, had she married Napoleon? I don't know. So, I mean, there's a huge amount of what ifs. She might have been happier as Madame Bonaparte. I don't know, but I don't think the man in her life did particularly well by her.
Yeah, well, guess I'll save that for my what ifs episode. But moving on, who is your number 9 wife of the Marshals?
So number 9, I have got Madame Saint-Cyr. She was born Anne Gouvion, and she was actually his first cousin. So in modern perceptions, we'd look at that and go, but it wasn't uncommon for the time.
Right.
But I sort of admire her for her forbearance in her marriage to somebody who must have been a particularly difficult person to manage, because Saint-Cyr, I get the sense of with him that I think if any of the Marshals could be psychologically studied, he would be the one who was most interesting to look at. He was introverted, he was unfriendly, he had poor social skills, in some ways a lot similarities to Davout. Yeah. But he'd been significantly psychologically affected by the fact that his mother had walked out on the family. There was a whole sort of clear element of trauma there that had affected him. But they had got married and they were childless for 20 years, actually, before their only son was born in 1815. So she became a first-time mother at 40. And I mean, that's considered a geriatric pregnancy now. So that must have been, a pretty scary prospect.
It's interesting to mention Davout in comparison, because you wonder, like, Davout and Amy, I think, had a very loving, even though he was the Iron Marshal. But I wonder if Saint-Cyr, when he got home, was he still the icy, cold Al guy, or was he more lovey-dovey?
I wouldn't have probably said he would have gone as far as could have been called lovey-dovey, but he certainly respected his wife.
Right.
Because one sort of snapshot we have to their marriage, and this is one of the things that kind of makes me admire Anne, she didn't let the great man have his way with everything. And there's a really nice sort of primary account of Alphonse Denis, who had served under the Marshal and had become a friend of the family. Mm-hmm. And he leaves a summary that on one occasion he had visited the Saint-Cyrs, and they preferred to live simply. They weren't one of the families who got carried away with their own importance.
Right.
And it kind of also shows that Saint-Cyr had no social skills. But he'd had a walk with Denis, and Saint-Cyr then made an off-the-cuff invitation for the young man to join the family for dinner, totally ignoring the discreet signals of his wife, clearly saying, do not ask him to dinner today. And it was a very small party. There was only the Marshal, his wife, their son, who was named after his father, and the son's tutor. Mm-hmm. And of course their guest. And throughout the meal, Madame Saint-Cyr kept apologizing to Denis for the simplicity of the fare, the lack of the variety of dishes, just basically good hostess, good manners. And she said, if you do us the honor of dining on another occasion, you'll find the table better stocked. We'll do better honor to you. At which point, Marshal, no social skills, pipes up. He's no idea what his wife was talking about, because they never ever had more than 6 dishes on the table, and he'd no idea why she was talking to me like he worshipped food. And she'd kind of tried to discreetly say, well, obviously you make a bit more effort when you have a guest, and just announce that's the end to the subject of food. We're going to talk about something else. But Denis did say in that same account, that's the only time in his long acquaintance with the Marshal he ever recalled him being sharp with his wife. Noted that he always showed her the greatest deference, but he did also note that the next time he dined with him, there were 7 dishes on the table. Sincere was totally oblivious, and he noted that Madame Sincere seemed very well pleased with herself. So she clearly didn't give in to her husband for everything, which I quite like.
Right. I like that story. And I think we should change his name to Marshall Lack of Social Skills. I like that.
Yeah, I made him a very difficult comrade. I mean, Oudinot found that out, especially
in Russia.
He was not an easy man to get on with.
Indeed. Well, credit to Anne for and from what I read, that until his passing, they had a good marriage.
Yeah, I think so. And she was with him right up to the end. And again, it was thanks to the account of Alphonse Denis. He visited them just before the Marshal's death. They found him quite at peace. He was quite relaxed in his wife's company.
But it's also interesting to me, speaking of the Marshals' wives, very few of them after the Marshals passed got remarried. And I don't know if that has to do with title or just love or dedication, but that I've read that very few got remarried after their husbands died.
Yeah, I mean, really, Madame Ney did, and I'm just trying to think off the top of my head, but no, I mean, I think you could count on one hand the number who did.
Well, moving along, who do we have at number 8?
I've got Madame Soult at number 8, and again, she's just I quite admire her character. And again, it was somebody who, even though the norm would have been that the husband was obviously the head of the household, especially when your husband was a highly titled marshal, but she was noted as being no pushover, and some considered that she ruled the roost at home. So again, I'm kind of quite drawn to that.
Yeah, I think I do recall. I think Napoleon was. Now he was using Marshal Soult all over the place for many years, and I think that probably upset Madame Soult, who was like, "Again, you're going on campaign." But it seems like they had a long, loving marriage, at least when he was home.
Yeah, they did. She was noted as having, significantly better manners than he did. But she was a kind of case in point of what we were saying about the disadvantages of being married to a marshal. They spent, a great deal of time apart while Soult was in the peninsula.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, at that point, he took a Spanish mistress. Whether she was aware of that, I don't know.
Right.
But he certainly seems to have, he was a man who very much respected the women in his life, and that wasn't just his wife, but his mother and his eldest sister as well.
Mm-hmm.
And when he built his chateau beside his birthplace, he didn't call it Chateau de Soult, he called it Chateau de Soultberg, which is Berg being his wife's maiden name. So I think it was a very equal partnership in a lot of ways. And of course, Soult is for me more than Bernadotte the great survivor of the Marshalate, because he had the most extensive post-Napoleon campaign career, of the lot.
Yeah.
And she saw him through all of that as well, and she was clearly a very intelligent woman as well. I mean, she was listed as a subscriber to English grammar compositions in the 1840s, so she could read in English. So yeah, no, I'm quite drawn to her.
Yeah, he did. He had a very interesting career. He had to obviously go into exile after Waterloo, but came back, became Marshal General of France. I think he was prime minister for a while. He really had an exceptional career after Napoleon's downfall, and I think she died shortly after he did in 1851 or something like that.
Yeah, 1851. No, sorry, he died in November 1851. She survived him by a couple of months, and yep. She died in March 1852, and it's a very weird coincidence for me, but Marshal Soult died on my birthday, and Madame Soult died on my husband's birthday, which is a bizarre little coincidence just to chuck in there.
Moving on, who do we have on the 7th slot?
Someone else who kind of really exemplified the major drawback of being married to a Marshal, and that was Madame La, who was left a widow, who was the first to be widowed of all the Marshals' wives, when Lan died aged 40.
Yeah. So I was reading your blog. Is this true? They had 5 kids under the age of 10 when he died. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so I mean, she was pregnant almost continuously for the sort of first 5 or 6 years of their marriage. So she was 18 when she married him in 1800. He was 31. So again, that wasn't unusual for the time. She was a young bride, considered very beautiful. Madame Junot said she looked like a Raphael or a Caravaggio painting. Depends which sources you look at. I've seen some of Lan's biographers who are really not fond of her at all, like excessively not fond of her. But I mean, their children, so they got married in 1800. Their first son was born in 1801, their second son in 1802, third in 1803, the fourth in 1804, and their daughter Josephine was born in 1806. Now, some sources do say potentially there might have been another daughter born in 1805 who died soon after that, but at least 5 children in 6 years.
Yeah.
At the age of 18, well, from the age of 18, with a husband who was very frequently absent.
What I also give her credit for is even after the Marshal died, she was still of aid to the empire, was she not?
Yeah, Napoleon genuinely respected her. He did with some. He had a very complex relationship with some of the women of his court. He could be unbelievably rude and abrasive and unpleasant, but when he genuinely liked somebody, he could be very charming and very generous and very supportive. And he was genuinely fond of Louise Lang. He wrote her a very compassionate letter when Lan died, and of course he was very passionately fond of Lan as well. And he saw to it that Lan, his late friend, was honoured as a hero with the empire, and he also saw to it that Lan's wife and children wanted for nothing. But it's a lot of sources agree that she never really forgave Napoleon for the loss. She remained at court. She was honoured as a lady of Napoleon's court, and when Napoleon divorced Josephine to marry Marie-Louise, he appointed Louise Lang to be mistress of the robes to the new empress, and she became a real close confidant of Marie-Louise. And some believe, and again that depends on what the sources you are reading, that it was her who actively persuaded Marie-Louise to go back to Austria following Napoleon's first abdication and not to join him on Elba, because Marie-Louise had initially said she was quite keen to join her husband on Elba.
Yeah.
And that apparently Louise La had talked her out of it as a sort of belated revenge on Napoleon by depriving him of his spouse in the way that Napoleon's battles had deprived her of hers. Now, whether that's true or not is total speculation, but she survived her husband by nearly 50 years.
Yeah, and I did want to also point out that was not Marshal Lan's first wife, right? The first one, I thought that was an interesting story as well.
Yeah, so he had a sort of youthful dalliance. His first wife, Paulette Méric, gave birth to a son while Lan was in Egypt, but he'd not seen his wife. Well, the general circumstances around that are accepted to be that he had not seen his wife for 10 months at the time of the birth.
Right.
Which was an obvious problem, and he divorced her in 1799 to go on to marry Louise the next year.
Well, moving on, we're going up to number 6 now, and who's on the list number 6?
This is Madame Suchet, Honorine Saint-Joseph, who is connected actually to Madame Bernadotte. We've already discussed. She was a niece of Désirée and Julie Clary, so effectively by marriage also a niece of Joseph Bonaparte and Marshal Bernadotte. So that's an interesting little connection to be starting your marriage off in the Marshalate.
She's in the Bonaparte solar system then.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting reading up on her that unlike Soult's wife and Victor's wife and Massena's wife, she actually went to Spain with the Marshal.
Yeah, I mean the story of their marriage is really bizarre. Because Suchet, um, was sent to Spain, famously one of the only marshals to come out of Spain with his reputation intact, to actually have enhanced it. But he started writing to his brother that he found military life lonely and, wanted a companion to share his life with. But rather than actually bothering going and finding and courting a woman for himself, he asked his brother to negotiate arrangements for a marriage for him. So they really kind of are quite unique in the story compared to the other marshals. She was, again, an 18-year-old bride. She was quite reluctant initially because she thought Suchet was actually 45 at the time. He was actually 38, so still 20 years her senior. And, she, thinking he was 45, she was quite reluctant. By which point Suchet picked up on her reluctance, and then so he started to get wary, but eventually all the misunderstandings were kind of cleared up, and they married in 1808. Joseph Bonaparte and Julie Clary, Bernadotte, Marshal Madame Bernadotte, even her sister, they witnessed the marriage. And she did accompany him to Spain, and they had a very mutually devoted relationship. She was instrumental to Suchet's Hearts and Minds campaign.
The Marshal and his wife would routinely just walk the streets and buy stuff from vendors without escorts. They didn't want to have that big military presence. They put the troops out in the countryside and just kind of governed in their own way.
Yeah, I mean, Suchet was the most politically astute, I think, of all the marshals, and he really recognised that ruling with an iron fist wasn't going to work. And she was part of that. She set the trends and the fashions in Valencia. And, when she had to leave to go back to Paris for confinement for the birth of their first child, again, so she wrote to his brother, and it's really nice the way he described her. She's embellished my life and made me suffer a sharp sorrow at our momentary separation. He writes about her. She's made everything about my life better. And it's lovely. They were really mutually devoted. But again, like so many of them, she outlived her husband by a huge amount of time, because Suchet died comparably young. He was only in his, I think, early 50s.
Yeah.
And she survived him by 58 years. She died aged 94.
Wow.
84. So she wasn't just predeceased by her husband, but actually 2 of her 3 children as well.
Yeah.
Lived a very long life.
Yeah, exceptional lady. I'd like to read up more on her story. Okay, we're in the top 5 now, which is, I'm looking at your top 5 now, and really you could put these 5 in any order, correct?
Yeah, definitely. It's, again, this is totally subjective. This is purely on the basis of who I personally am most drawn to. There's no science involved at all.
All right, well, no further ado, who is your number 5?
It's Madame Ney, and again, somebody whose story is particularly tragic.
Yeah, and again, much like Soult's wife, Ney was constantly on the battlefront. Like he wasn't home very often that I can recall.
No, and again, I mean, people talk about the huge amounts of money that Napoleon threw at people who served him well, and actually, Madame Junot talks about the Neys, and that Madame Ney spent, quite lavishly and made their home very comfortable, but that must have been very poor compensation for being left on your own all the time.
Yeah, let's talk about Aglaé. Which she was also, we talked about earlier, she was related sort of within the Louis XVI retinue, correct?
Yeah, so her maternal aunt was Madame Campan, who famously educated Caroline Bonaparte and Hortense de Beauharnais as well. But her mother was a lady of the chamber to Queen Marie Antoinette, and the horrors of the revolution and the Queen's execution seemed to sort of just push Aglaé's mother over the edge, and she took her own life in 1794, the day before Robespierre's fall, before the end of the Terror. And that's just the timing of it seems to make it even more tragic than than anything else. And so she was left motherless. But she became, a very close friend of Hortense de Beauharnais, who's a pretty good judge of character, and said that Aglaé was full of kindness. She was very sensitive, very, just very pleasant to be around. And through that connection with Hortense, she came to the notice of Josephine, and Josephine made it sort of her mission to find her daughter's very genteel, pretty friend a suitable husband. And she thought, Ney will do just nicely. He's dashing, he's, good looking, he's got everything going for him. And that was kind of after a little bit of negotiation on both sides. They were married in 1802.
What I think is also interesting about Madame Ney, and I'm going to jump ahead to 1815 now, she was just as fearless to beg on your husband's behalf to save his life. She went to Wellington, she went to King Louis XVIII, basically everyone in Paris. She was working, I think, nonstop overtime to save her husband's life, correct?
Yeah, I mean, she went to absolutely everyone. She pleaded in every direction. There was nobody she didn't petition. And one of Ney's English biographers kind of sums it up, and the way he expresses it, I think, just kind of really emphasizes the tragedy of it. Like, she haunted the offices of Dupont and Berrière. At home, she was busy with endless letters, claiming for her husband the pardon and the immunity which the Convention of Paris seemed to guarantee. She wrote to the Prince Regent, she wrote to Wellington, and she really all but put herself on her knees begging for Ney's life. And the coldness and the total, almost inhuman level of apathy she was shown really disgusts me.
Yeah, and I can only imagine that last night that she took the kids to see Ney in prison. That must have been just awful.
Yeah, because their children were really young at the time. I think the youngest was only 2 or 3. And how do you even begin to explain that to your children? And one of them sort of cried through the whole ordeal, and she, even though they had that last goodbye, and Ney said to his son, "You must always love and honor your mother," she wasn't content to give up. She went for one last trip to the Tuileries to plead for last minute clemency.
Yeah.
And by the time she arrived, she was kept waiting. Nobody would see her. And by the time somebody deigned to actually give her attention, she was told, "There's no point in you being here. It's over." And she fainted.
Yeah, and I've talked about it on other episodes, but the Bourbons killing Ney was a mistake, and I think it stained their reign. Even Charles X's reign, it just stuck with them. And I think Madame Ney, although it was her husband, she knew it was a mistake too. Like, why are you killing this man? So it must have been, I don't know, just tragic all around.
I'm very famously not pro Bourbon at all. And if you're going to try and frame yourselves as the good guys, the rightful heirs, etc., and then you have an armistice signed, as was the case, and Davout argued at the trial.
Yep.
If you go back on that, you can't then claim to be the honourable side.
Correct. What happened with Madame Ney after the Marshal's death?
She found loneliness really hard to bear, and she is one of the few Marshals who did Marshal's wives who did remarry. In her widowhood, she married General Louis de Résigny. She travelled quite a lot. She visited Hortense. She saw her 2 eldest sons enter Swedish service. Interestingly, the service of her husband's former comrade, the former Marshal Bernadotte. And it was only really under the July monarchy that Ney's pension was restored and his sons were permitted to serve in France. So it was a long shadow hanging over her. And she survived Ney by 40 years.
Yeah, tough lady.
Yeah.
Speaking of tough ladies, who do we have at number 4?
So number 4, and I really did slither a bit putting her higher, but again, you could put these 5 in any order, is Amy Davout.
To be married to the Iron Marshal is one thing, but she was also within that solar system of Napoleon's family, right?
Yeah, so her brother was General Leclerc, who died um, on the expedition to Haiti.
Mm-hmm.
So she was already quite well connected, and he, of course, was married by this point to Napoleon's sister.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
he wanted his sister to be well settled, knowing that he was going to be abroad for quite some time. Did he know he was going to come back? All those things that must have preyed on his mind. And he wanted to see that his youngest sister was securely provided for before he left. Now, allegedly, according to one of Davout's biographers, he actually suggested Lamb initially. Because Lamb was good looking, he was dashing, he had visually everything going for him.
Right.
And Amy found him uncouth, which doesn't really say much for Lamb, I suspect, when Davout is considered the better prospect.
Well, and he didn't dress well. He was bald. He wore glasses. He wasn't the most dashing of the Marshals, I would say.
No, he wasn't dashing, but she met Davout, and the two of them were taken with each other. They suited each other down to the ground, and their marriage contract was actually signed not just by the customary notary, but also by Napoleon and Josephine. So it indicated that she very much was moving into the Bonaparte family circle.
Now, Amy wasn't real thrilled with Napoleon, though, correct?
No, she never forgave him for the death of her brother, who never did come back to France. He died in Haiti. And then she had a really, really hard time, because following very quickly on the back of her brother's death was the death of the Davout's firstborn child. It was a son named Paul, and he died just before his first birthday. And that horrific trauma was then exacerbated by the fact that their second child died basically in exactly the same circumstances and died just before they turned one. It was a daughter this time. Now, to lose your brother, who in many ways had been like a father to her, and not just one child but two children just before their first birthdays. I mean, not unexpectedly, she was plunged into like a really dark depression. And of course, Davout's frequently absent because he's on campaign. And in some of his letters, he tried to encourage her, try and socialize a bit more. Don't spend all your time alone. Visit with Madame Soult. She was a friend of Madame Soult. Try and visit her, have her to stay. When she got pregnant again in 1805, she was kind of beset with prepartum anxiety because what was going to happen to this child. And again, she was left on her own. It must have been really, really difficult.
But the dichotomy is kind of interesting, because Marshal Davout famously is one of Napoleon's most devoted marshals. And then he's to Amy, who really doesn't like the emperor.
Yeah, it's one of the few things they really disagreed on. And she was offered a position as a lady to Madame Mère, to Napoleon's mother, and very wisely, because Letizia Bonaparte, Letizia, sorry, I'm pronouncing that wrong. She was about as friendly as an angry dragon, I suspect, and Amy wasn't keen.
Yeah.
And she turned down the position several times on the grounds of her health, and she didn't feel well enough to do it. And again, there's correspondence from Davout that really tried to, we need to think of all that he's given us, and we really need to show our gratitude. And he really tries to persuade her, but eventually said, look, I'll leave this to your judgment. And so she declined the position. So she wasn't status hungry, but I think she was a pretty savvy judge of character as well.
She was. And jumping ahead again to 1815, after Napoleon's downfall, Davout, like you said earlier during the Ney piece, he testified in support of Marshal Ney at his trial. And because of that, they get stripped of almost everything, right? They're living hand to mouth.
Yeah, so they'd gone from being, at the pinnacle of the empire. Davout was very well rewarded financially, but Davout was banished to Louviers. He was stripped of his honours. His salary was taken away. So they were reduced to living, on literally a handful of francs a day. And his mother-in-law wrote of them, oh, they live without servants. Now, again, to us, that seems like, well, so what?
Yeah.
But it's a real fall in, status, their whole standard of living, completely disappeared overnight. And Marshal Davout couldn't go anywhere. He was suspect. The Bourbons did not trust him. They did not want him to go anywhere. They didn't want him to move. And it was 2 years before Davout's honor and finances were restored. So, that must have been a pretty tough 2 years. And it was her who had to step up and take on so much of the work at that point, because he couldn't.
Like we were saying at the beginning, how the fortunes kind of were like a roller coaster. You were up one moment and then down the next moment. And even in this case, when he's finally reinstated as a marshal and gets his titles back, another, I guess, a hit out of nowhere takes Marshal Davout's life.
Yeah, they just seem to be getting back on their feet, and there's great celebration at their estate in 1820 because their eldest surviving daughter, Josephine, gets married, and the event's attended by so many sort of Bonapartist officers that it was subject to conspiracy rumors, and it really seemed like for Marshal and Madame Davout that they were getting this sort of second chance at a bit of joy.
Right.
But their daughter died, within a year in childbirth, and she was only 16. And that's the loss that just broke Davout, particularly Davout. I mean, she had been the one who'd struggled so much with the early losses, and Davout had been really attached to his daughter, and it just seemed to just totally, completely rob him almost of the will to keep fighting. And his health just deteriorated from that point. And so, having lost her daughter, Amy then loses her husband just 2 years later in 1823.
I just goosebumps though, like thinking about you lose your daughter 1 year and then your husband not long after. I mean, talk about a tough lady.
Yeah, I mean, she was predeceased by 5 of her 8 children. That's, again, there's just no money in the world. Yeah. There's no title in the world as compensating anybody for that. But she did see her youngest daughter, Adelaide Louise, who I did manage to get a few posts up earlier on in March for Women's History Month, become a famous woman in letters. I mean, she was a really accomplished young woman. She published novels. She was very famously presided over a salon and honoured Davout's memory. Mm-hmm. So she did get to, some comfort of seeing that her daughter thrive.
Yeah, no, it's good to hear. Moving on, who do we have at number 3? Another tragic story, correct?
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. I mean, tragedy seems to be the recurring theme.
Yeah.
For a lot of these women, their lives weren't, cushy. It's Angelique Pierre, Madame Brune, and somebody whose courage is like superhuman.
Yeah, and you mentioned it's strange again. They are cushy in the fact that they had a lot of money coming to them. Whether through the emperor or through titles, Prince of Pontecorvo or whatever dukedoms or fiefdoms they were awarded, but their personal lives were just awful. And case in point, Madame Brune. Now, the Marshal himself, he didn't do a lot during the Empire, right? It was more about his death and afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, he was never a great favorite of Napoleon's at all. He was the most Jacobin of all the marshals. He was properly like Republican through and through. He'd been an associate of Danton. He'd really, played a part in the revolution. Mm-hmm. And he fell foul of Napoleon relatively early on, so he had nothing like the the Napoleonic careers that most of the others had, and famously that's reflected in the lack of titles as well. He's got no dukedom, he's got no princedom compared to most of the others we've been discussing. Quite unexpected that Brune rallies to Napoleon when so many of his better rewarded comrades stay away, but he does go back to Napoleon during the 100 Days, and it's fatal.
Yeah, unfortunately for him, he's assigned a royalist area of France to kind of guard. And I think it's on the return to Paris that he's attacked by a mob and killed violently. Is that right?
Yeah. again, we can question a lot of the decisions Napoleon makes during the 100 Days, but he sends this most Jacobin of all his marshals to the royalist south. And he eventually has to surrender and to get back to Paris. He initially requests safe passage with Admiral Pellew, he of hornblower fame, and the admiral rejects it. He calls him the Prince of Scamps. You know, he's a looter, he's a Jacobin, he doesn't want anything to do with him. So Brune has to make his way back to Paris, essentially with a target on his back. And he is mistakenly identified when he stops to change horses. He's mistakenly identified as the man who had carried the head of the princess to Lamballe. Now, we know he definitely wasn't,
right? Because
war archives have him somewhere else at the time. The mob weren't, you know, ready to fact check. He was set upon. He had to sort of flee with it for his life. He took shelter in a hotel. Last actions were to try and write a letter to his wife. I'm not sure whether he actually managed to complete it, but he was set upon, he was shot, he was stabbed multiple times, and his corpse was thrown into the river. So his body had been left to float for several days, then it was buried in an unmarked grave. It took Angelique 2 years to find his remains. And it was her who had the body embalmed. It was her who arranged for her husband's remains to be brought back home while she fought to clear his name, because the Bourbons had the cause of death noted as suicide. So it was a cover-up. It's not, again, if you're meant to be the honourable side, the fact that you have murdered somebody in particularly violent circumstances doesn't reflect pretty well. So it's noted as suicide, which of course has implications for how he could be buried. So she had to fight tooth and nail for 6 years for the cause of death to be changed to murder. I mean, a bit like Madame Ney, she petitioned everybody. She wrote to the court. She had letters sent to the king, and it took her 6 years before this was finally corrected, and she was able to have her husband appropriately interred. And it's really tragic that she died in 1838 and never saw the statue that was raised to Marshal Brune not that long afterwards.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, Marshal Brune was a famous looter, so I'm sure they had a good bit of money tucked away. Maybe not, but she didn't have to do all this, like find her husband's body, fight and write letters and argue in front of courts about the true facts for her husband's death, but she did. And I think that's why she's so high on the list.
Yeah, I mean, they came together when she was a metal burnisher when he met her. They'd come from nothing basically and had come up through the ranks together. I mean, quite a lot of the marshals came up through the ranks and then sort of found slightly better connected brides who would have been considered their social superiors. Brune and Angelique, they had been together from the start. They adopted 2 daughters. They were childless biologically, but yeah, her widowhood is just the most horrific story, and it's only because of her that her husband gets a decent burial. It wasn't any effort on anybody else's behalf.
You wonder even if the biographers would have listed it in all the annals of Napoleon's story that, oh, Marshal Brune committed suicide. I wonder if that would have been the fact of the case if Angelique hadn't done all this.
I don't know. I really don't know.
Yeah. On to our top 2. Now, again, these could flip-flop either way. I think you have it ranked properly just looking at it. But who is number 2?
So number 2 is a woman who exemplifies very different sort of courage to Madame Brune, but nonetheless admirable, is Eugénie de Coucy, who became the second Madame Oudinot.
Yeah, I was just reading Marshal Oudinot's memoirs that she compiled, correct?
Yeah, she was instrumental in organizing Oudinot's memoirs. We probably wouldn't have had them without her.
Yeah, I mean, I know the part you're probably going to get to. I found this part interesting. During the invasion of France in 1814, she rode out to the front with a bunch of food for her husband. And Oudinot was kind of shocked to see her there. And he's like, oh, do you mind if I share this with my neighbor? He's hungry as well. Yeah, Eugenie's like, well, who's your neighbor? And he says, oh, Marshal MacDonald. So it just goes to show the desperate state of the French army at that time. But that wasn't her only time riding to the front, was it not?
No, so she was 19 when she caught Oudinot's eye. He'd actually been sort of considering her as a potential wife for his eldest son, because Oudinot by that point was 44. He had 8 children and had been was a widower. She'd actually usually had known the first Madame Oudinot and thought very well of her. So he sent a proposal, saying basically, tell Madame de Cussy, I'm 44, I have 500,000 francs in rent, my social position's well known, I'll be happy to share it with her. And he was very forthright and to the point, and she accepted. So she was only 20 when she became a duchess. Her husband was more than twice her age, and sort of less than 2 weeks after the marriage, Oudinot had to leave for the invasion of Russia. So that's only, 2 weeks of being married to somebody who is, more than twice her age.
Right.
She could have just sat on the title and looked very elegant and busied herself at home. But she was genuinely really anxious about him. She was really worried about his health. Oudinot, very famously, didn't have a great track record when it came to keeping safe. And she took delivery of a bust to the Marshal, and the shoulder fell off, and she was convinced it was an omen, and it genuinely was. I mean, Oudinot's that same shoulder was shattered at Polotsk in mid-August.
Yeah.
Now Napoleon had issued orders that no woman should cross the Niemen, but she got word of her husband's injury. Again, this is a young woman, aged 20, who'd had a cushy upbringing. She was from sort of well-to-do family, and she was determined she was going after him. So she got one of her uncles to accompany her, and she set off in a carriage, traveled to Russia in that carriage.
And almost everyone, I think even Marshal Augereau was like, look, you can't go up there. It's very dangerous. Like, there's Cossacks everywhere. You can't do this. And she went anyways.
Yeah, he said to her, well, you're going to have to dress in leather. And, she did. She made her way through Lithuania, and she got to her husband at Vilna. And again, she'd packed, very similarly, had packed plenty of provisions. And she'd brought, a crate of bottles of wine. And she was pleased to see that the Marshal was recovering, and was really pleased to be able to say, I've brought some comforts to make you feel better. And he kept one bottle and gave the rest to his men. And she sort of, on the one hand, was really proud that her husband was so kind. But then in the next, she sort of said, I wish he'd kept a bit more from himself. Her own account, if you've read the memoirs, you've gone through it, of, the cold, of the trying to thaw a frozen chicken, cooking it and only getting condensation, nothing being able to, not being able to cook, the wounds, the suffering that she witnessed.
Right.
This was not somebody who was accustomed to military life, accustomed to hardship. And she endured it. She endured it just the same, not the same circumstances. Obviously, she wasn't carrying a rifle or a pack or a musket, but she still endured that the same as any man.
Yeah, I don't recall many of the other Marshals' wives going to the front lines like that. However, after 1815 and the whole Waterloo 100 days, Oudinot kind of stays at home, and it kind of ruins the relationship between Oudinot and Davout, who obviously rejoins as emperor. Do you think Eugenie had something to do with that?
Well, Napoleon liked to think it was, but then Napoleon was a rampant misogynist, so I suspect he would anyway. He sort of said, that Oudinot was enthralled to his very pretty young wife who came from a good family, and it was really because of him that he'd made that decision. But she recounts, and again, obviously we're taking her word for it, but in her memoirs, that Oudinot was a man of honor, and he really sort of struggled with that decision. But he had given his word post abdication. He'd given his word of honor to the Bourbons, and that meant something to him, and he couldn't go back on that oath. But he said to Napoleon, since I will not serve you, sire, I will serve no one. So he and his wife lived quietly at that time. Marshal Davout did send a very cold letter to him, but he wasn't vindictive about that. I mean, he was very active in arguing for Davout's restoration to his honours. He acted on his friend's behalf even afterwards.
Yeah, and then obviously after Napoleon's final exile, Marshal himself lives a long time despite all of his wounds, as does Eugenie, correct?
Yeah, I mean they live a very comfortable life. They are in really good standing with the Bourbons, so much so that Louis XVIII and the Duchess of Angoulême stood as godparents to some of their children. He and Eugenie have four children, and they're a really devoted, loving couple. Their correspondence is really warm and tender. There was a trove of their letters sold in at auction in 2017. She kind of softened a lot of Eugene's rough edges. He'd had a very prodigious temper. And the only real blight on their happiness was the early death of one of Eugene's sons from his first wife on active service in Africa. But I mean, Eugene lives unbelievably for a walking bullet magnet. He lives into his 80s. It's
Yeah.
amazing. She obviously being much younger survived him for 20 years, and she died at the age of 76. So they were both alive to see Napoleon's remains return to Paris.
Okay, here we are. We've gotten to number one. Who do we have listed here? Top spot.
Number one is my very, very totally biased option, because I just think I would have gotten on with this woman so brilliantly. I just love everything about her. Is Catherine Hubscher, who became Madame Lefebvre.
Okay, she comes from very common origins. Why? And she had a very tragic personal life with her children. Why does she stand out as number one? Why do you like her so much?
I really so I'm working class. I'm not very pro monarchy personally myself. I really like everything that the Lefebvres stood for. They were very much of humble origin. She'd worked as an ironer, then as a laundress. You know, Lefebvre was, a sergeant in the guards. When they married, they realistically had pretty poor prospects. They were really devoted to each other. She was illiterate. He taught her to read and write. But realistically, their expectations out of life in terms of their income, of their chance of owning property and so on, would have been pretty poor. And they become the Duke and Duchess of Danzig.
Yeah.
It's such a meteoric rise. I mean, it is effectively rags to riches. So the drama of that story is really compelling. But again, it's a real equal partnership, and I really like that. He's the one who teaches her to read and write. It's a marriage of equals. They're devoted to each other. They're very blunt. They're very plain speaking. And I just like that. They never forgot where they came from. They didn't get carried away with their own grandeur. They didn't suddenly think they were royalty, as some of the others did. They were just true to themselves.
And Napoleon liked her as well, correct?
He really did, yeah. And again, when he was genuinely fond of someone, he didn't hide it. And at one occasion, where somebody rather snootily remarked that it pleased Napoleon to raise Madame de Lefebvre to the title of Duchess, Napoleon, very, very, sharply shot back. Actually, it had pleased him to raise the title of Duchess to Madame Lefebvre. And I quite like that. He thought well of her.
Yeah, and when you mentioned the Frank speaking, when she met Marshal Bernadotte when he returned to Paris in 1815, that didn't go well for Bernadotte.
No, I mean she spoke her mind. She was very forthright. There was no. She was one of those people where what we would say in Scotland, she called a spade a spade. And Marshal Bernadotte came to call on some of his former colleagues. Of course, by that point, he's heir to he's Crown Prince of Sweden. And following the second abdication, wants to call on some of his former comrades. And Madame Lefebvre had made it known that she did not enjoy the company of traitors and had the door closed.
Well, I guess he didn't go back knocking on that door. Well, let's briefly touch on their children and just another tragic story here.
Yeah, I mean they were very good people. They did an enormous amount of charity. They supported their local communities. They lifted up relatives who were in less fortunate circumstances than they were, but they really were dealt the most awful hand by fate. And throughout the course of the marriage, Catherine gave birth 14 times. 12 of those children died in infancy. 2 sons survived. 1 died in his teens, and the last became a brigadier general. So you can understand how much he would have exemplified the hope, the pride, the joy of the Lefebvres. He was everything they had, and he died from exposure in the retreat from Russia.
Right.
And the correspondence that survives at that time kind of just destroys, as you would expect, it destroys them.
Yeah.
The level of loss, I can't even get my head around it. You can't quantify, a level of loss like that. 14 children.
Yeah, and famously, after 1815, he has a mansion. They both live well, like you said. They do a lot of charity work. They're in Belize, taking care of the wounded soldiers of the empire. But he dies. He was an elderly man even at the beginning of the Napoleonic era, and he dies, I think, in 1820.
Yeah, and she survives him for another 15 years. But there's these really sort of tragic summaries of her that without him, she didn't really seem to know what to do with herself anymore. He was gone, her children were gone. She still gave generously. She looked after anybody that she could. She could be relied upon to support any relations who were less fortunate than her. But she stayed away from the court, and she said it doesn't feel like home anymore. It felt like home, the Napoleonic court, where they were mixing with, people of all sorts of backgrounds, but people like her didn't belong at the Tuileries anymore.
Right.
And I sort of think she's summed up by one of her quotes, and I really think it sums up not just her, but the Lefebvre's relationship and why they are. I mean, he's the Marshal I like best. I admire Davout. I champion him as the greatest of the Marshals, but Lefebvre is the man I like the best. And she sort of said, I might forget that I'm a duchess. I will never forget that I'm Lefebvre's wife.
That is lovely. And yeah, he definitely had the best quotes of the Marshals, Lefebvre did. So there we go. There we have it. We got all the way to number 1. That was epic. All tough ladies, all smart ladies, survivors like their husbands. Yeah, do you have more superlatives to lay on these ladies?
Yeah, I just think it's important to remember that courage in that era wasn't solely about what was done on a battlefield. There were many different types of courage, and a lot of these women exemplified it to the ultimate degree.
Agreed, 100%. Thank you so much, Rachel. That was brilliant as always. And again, my audience, if you'd like to learn more about Rachel, I highly recommend you check her out on X, Twitter. Bookish Rachel, bookish_Rachel is her handle. And as always, it is an extreme pleasure, my friend, to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.